It's the summer of 2017, and out on the Tasman Sea, a ship called the Geologists Resolution is drilling straight down through nearly a kilometer of open ocean, then straight down again through the seabed itself. This isn't a treasure hunt, it's an international scientific expedition, and the crew isn't looking for oil or gold or anything you'd expect to find under open water. They're pulling up long cylinders of rock and mud, sediment core after sediment core, from 6 different sites scattered across water that, on every map you've ever looked at, is just ocean. And then someone in the ship's lab looks closer at one of those cores. Under a microscope, in rock dated to somewhere between 50 and 80 million years old, they find pollen, fern spores, seeds from flowering plants, the shells of creatures that only live in shallow water, the kind you could wade into. None of that grows in the deep sea. None of that grows underwater at all. So here's the question that should be sitting in your stomach right now. What was a forest doing at the bottom of the Pacific? I'm not going to answer that yet because the real answer is stranger than there used to be an island here. What that ship pulled out of the seafloor in 2017 wasn't evidence of an island. It was the last piece of evidence for something almost nobody outside a small circle of geologists had ever said out loud. That underneath the waves, in plain sight the entire time, there is a continent, a real one, the size of the Indian subcontinent, and depending on how you count, it had been sitting there, submerged, for tens of millions of years, while humanity built maps of the entire planet and simply never noticed it was missing one. The book that sent me down this particular rabbit hole isn't really a book at all. It's a paper, but one written and argued like a manifesto, published in 2017 in the journal GSA Today by a geologist named Nick Mortimer and 10 colleagues. Its title is almost defiantly plain: Zealandia, Earth's Hidden Continent. I want to be upfront about something before we go further, because this channel only works if I'm honest with you about where the science is solid ground and where it's still being argued. Most of what Mortimer and his team laid out in that paper is about as settled as geology gets. The measurements, the maps, the crust itself, all independently checked and rechecked since. But there's a piece of this story, right at its coldest, most submerged point in deep time, that scientists still don't agree on. I'll tell you exactly where that line is when we get there. I won't pretend it's resolved when it isn't. Here's the thing that makes this whole story so unsettling once you actually sit with it. You have an assumption baked so deep into how you think about the world that you've never had a reason to examine it. A continent, you'd say, is land. It's the stuff you can stand on. It's what's dry. Everything else, the blue 2/3 of every globe you've ever spun, that's the other category. Ocean, not land. The opposite of continent. That assumption is wrong. Not wrong like a rounding error. Wrong like discovering the map you've been using your whole life has a 2 million square mile blank spot that isn't blank at all. It's just been colored the same shade of blue as everything around it. Geologists don't actually define a continent by whether it's wet or dry. They never have. A continent is defined by what it's made of, and how thick it is, and how it sits, elevated above the ocean floor around it, made of a particular kind of lighter, silica-rich rock, distinct in its composition from the crust underneath the open sea, and large enough, coherent enough, to count as its own landmass rather than just a scrap of debris. 4 criteria. None of them mention rain or coastlines or whether you could pitch a tent on it. And once you strip dry out of the definition, something extraordinary falls out the other side. There is a landmass, roughly 4.9 million square kilometers of it, nearly the size of the Indian subcontinent, that meets every one of those 4 criteria. It has the right elevation relative to the seafloor around it. It's made of the right kind of rock. It's clearly bounded, clearly its own coherent thing, not a jumble of disconnected fragments. And it is, by the most careful modern estimates, about 94% underwater. Let that sink in, because I mean it literally. 94% of an entire continent is submerged beneath the Pacific and the Tasman Sea, and the only pieces still poking up into daylight are what you already know as New Zealand and New Caledonia, and a scatter of smaller islands around them. You've probably seen footage of New Zealand's coastline. Maybe you've stood on it. What almost nobody tells you is that you'd have been standing on the exposed 6% of something enormous, the peak of a landmass so large that if you could drain the ocean around it, it would utterly dwarf the sliver of it we call a country. And here's the part that should really bother you. Nobody just discovered New Zealand sits on something big. Geologists had pieces of this puzzle for decades before 2017. Rock samples, seismic surveys, magnetic readings off the seafloor. All of it had been quietly accumulating in scientific papers since long before Mortimer's team ever sat down to write their argument. The fragments were mapped. They just weren't assembled. Nobody had stood back, looked at the whole scattered collection of evidence, and said the word continent out loud. The closest anyone came was in 1995, when a geologist named Bruce Luyendyk needed a convenient label for this collection of underwater crust he was studying. The ridges, the plateaus, the submerged shelves stretching out from New Zealand into the Pacific. He called it Zealandia, but he was explicit about what he meant by that. It was a name of convenience, a label to keep his notes organized, not a claim. He wasn't arguing this scattered geological zone was a continent. He was just giving cartographers and geologists a single word to point to instead of listing coordinates every time. So for another 22 years, that's what Zealandia was. A useful label. A regional term tucked into academic papers, known to specialists, invisible to everyone else. Imagine that for a second. A landmass close to the size of India, sitting on Earth's surface this entire time, and the only thing anyone had bothered to give it was a nickname. Not a classification, a nickname. What changed between 1995 and 2017 wasn't the rock. The rock had been down there, unmoved, for tens of millions of years. What changed was the resolution of the picture. Satellite gravity data got sharper, sonar mapping of the seafloor got denser. Rock dredge samples from research ships added up year after year, cruise after cruise, until Mortimer and his colleagues had something no one before them had actually possessed. A complete enough picture to run Zealandia through those 4 continental tests, properly, rigorously, all the way down. And it passed, every single measure, the elevation profile rising cleanly out of the surrounding oceanic crust rather than blending into it. The composition, silicic, granitic, continental rock, not the dark basalt that makes up the ocean floor everywhere else on the planet. The coherent boundaries, the sheer defined area of it, 4 for 4. Here's a number worth sitting with before we go further, because it's the number that turns this from a curiosity into something almost vertiginous. Ordinary continental crust, the kind under your feet right now, wherever you're standing on this planet, typically runs somewhere around 30 to 46 kilometers thick. That's the buffer, the depth of rock beneath you that makes land. Ocean floor, by contrast, is thin, a crust of dense basalt just a handful of kilometers deep before you hit mantle. Zealandia's crust measures somewhere between 10 and 30 kilometers thick, thinner than a typical continent, still unmistakably, dramatically thicker than the ocean floor around it. It's not oceanic crust that happens to be deep. It's continental crust that got stretched, thinned, and pulled down low enough that the sea closed over the top of it. Which raises the obvious question, the one your gut is probably already reaching for. How does a continent get thin? How does something the size of a subcontinent go from standing above the waves to lying beneath them? This isn't a story about land breaking apart and sinking in some catastrophic collapse, some Atlantis-style vanishing act. The real mechanism is slower, stranger, and in a way far more unsettling, because it isn't an accident of geological history. It's a process happening on this planet right now, in multiple places, while you sit there listening to this. Picture something simpler than a continent. Picture a candy bar held at both ends and slowly, patiently pulled apart. Nothing snaps at first, it just thins in the middle. The material doesn't disappear. It stretches, spreads, gets thinner across a wider area, while the two ends stay thick and solid. That's rifting. That's what happened to Zealandia starting around 80 million years ago, when it was still attached to the ancient southern supercontinent geologists call Gondwana. Gondwana was coming apart. Antarctica, Australia, South America, Zealandia, all of it had been fused together for an immense stretch of Earth's history. And around that point, roughly 80 million years back, the forces pulling the planet's crust in different directions finally won. Zealandia was wrenched away from the piece that would become Antarctica and Australia, and as it separated, its crust did exactly what that candy bar does. It stretched, it thinned. Rock that had been 30-40 kilometers deep in places got drawn down toward 10-20-30 kilometers. Thinner, weaker, more stretched than it had ever been while still bolted into the side of a supercontinent. Now, here's where isostasy comes in, and I promise this is simpler than the word sounds. Continental crust doesn't just sit on top of the mantle below it, it floats. Think of an iceberg. The reason an iceberg rides high out of the water isn't magic, it's buoyancy. A thick chunk of ice displaces enough water to keep most of its bulk floating above the surface. A thin sliver of ice, by contrast, barely clears the waterline at all. Same substance, different thickness, wildly different amount of it visible above the surface. Continents work the same way, except instead of floating on water, they float on the slow, hot plastic rock of the mantle underneath them. A thick slab of continental crust rides high enough to clear sea level by a comfortable margin, high enough to be the dry, walkable land you and I take entirely for granted. A thinner slab of the exact same kind of rock, the same composition, the same continental identity, doesn't ride nearly as high. It settles lower, and if it gets thin enough, the top of it slips below the waterline entirely. That is what happened to Zealandia. Not a collapse, not a flood pouring in from some catastrophic event, a settling, a gradual patient subsidence as its stretched, thinned crust lost its buoyancy inch by inch over millions of years and rode lower and lower against the surrounding sea, the way a trapdoor lowers slowly on a hinge rather than a floor giving way all at once. There was no single moment anyone could have watched and pointed to and said, "There, that's when the continent went under." It was a margin narrowing, year after year, for longer than the human mind is built to intuitively grasp, until one day the ocean simply covered what had, for millions of years before that, been standing in the open air. And this is the detail that I think is the most quietly disturbing part of the entire story, the part that turns Zealandia from a geological oddity into something that implicates every continent on this planet, including the one you're standing on right now or sitting above this very moment. Rifting isn't some relic process that only happened to unlucky landmasses deep in Earth's history and then stopped. It's happening today. Right now, the basin and range region of the western United States is stretching, thinning, exactly the way Zealandia's crust once did. Right now, in East Africa, the Afar region is being pulled apart by the same forces, slowly widening a rift that geologists watch as a preview of a future ocean. Right now, the Aegean Sea, between Greece and Turkey, sits over crust, doing this same slow, thinning dance. None of those regions are Zealandia. None of them are guaranteed to end up 94% underwater in 50 million years. But the mechanism underneath your feet, wherever you happen to be listening to this, is not some fixed, permanent guarantee written into the structure of the world. It is a margin. A buoyancy budget your patch of crust happens to currently be running a surplus on, and margins, by their nature, are things that can run out. So how low did Zealandia actually go? This is where I have to be honest with you about something, because it's the one place in this story where the evidence doesn't line up neatly, where scientists who've spent careers on this question still don't agree with each other. Somewhere around 25 to 22 million years ago, during a stretch of Earth's history called the Oligocene, Zealandia appears to have reached its lowest point, its smallest exposed area, its thinnest margin above the waves. And there's a real, live argument in the scientific literature about just how small that exposed area actually got. One camp of researchers looking at the sedimentary record argues Zealandia went fully underwater at that low point. The entire landmass, every scrap of it, submerged with nothing poking above the surface at all. Not an island, not a reef, nothing. The other camp isn't convinced, and their evidence is strange enough that I want to walk you through it, because it comes from an animal you might not expect to matter to a story about continental crust. In 2009, researchers working with fossils found something that reignited this entire debate. A fossil from the Miocene, tens of millions of years after that Oligocene low point, that belongs to the same lineage as a peculiar reptile still alive today in New Zealand called the tuatara. The tuatara isn't a lizard, not technically. It's the last surviving member of an order of reptiles that split off from lizards and snakes roughly 200 million years ago, a living fragment of a much older branch of the reptile family tree. And the argument goes like this: if that fossil lineage was present in New Zealand in the Miocene, not long after the supposed total drowning event, then some scrap of dry land must have persisted through that low point for a population of tuatara ancestors to have survived on. You can't have a founding population of an ancient reptile lineage magically reappear from nothing. Something had to be standing above the waterline the whole time, holding a population, however small, however precarious. That's not the only piece of evidence the persistence camp points to. There's a native New Zealand frog genus called Leiopelma, primitive enough in its biology that its lineage is thought to stretch back an extraordinarily long way, another line of evidence for land that never fully vanished. There's kauri, the towering native tree whose own lineage has been used to argue the same thing. And there's a remarkable fossil deposit called the St. Bathans fauna, a snapshot of an entire ancient ecosystem, birds, crocodilians, other reptiles, that had to have been living somewhere on emergent Zealandian land in the millions of years after that supposed total drowning. Here's the honest, unresolved shape of it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Even the scientists arguing for persistence, for land that never fully disappeared, concede that whatever stayed above water at Zealandia's lowest point may have been vanishingly small. Some estimates put the surviving exposed land at as little as around 1% of Zealandia's present-day area, something in the neighborhood of 2,500 square kilometers or a bit more, scattered fragments clinging above the waterline while nearly everything else around them slipped under. That's not a continent by then. That's a handful of islands, maybe a chain of them, holding on by the thinnest possible margin while the rest of a landmass the size of India sat drowned beneath the Tasman Sea and the Pacific around it. Nobody has settled which version is correct: total submergence or a scattering of tenacious refuges holding a scrap of biology together through the worst of it. I'm not going to pretend to resolve it for you here, because the honest answer is that the rock record and the biological record are, right now, in genuine tension with each other, and the scientists closest to this question are still working it out. What isn't in question is what happened next. Whatever the truth of that low point, Zealandia's crust never stopped being continental crust. It sat there, submerged or nearly submerged, for millions more years, unclaimed, unmapped in its entirety, known only in scattered fragments to the geologists who happened to be studying pieces of the Pacific seafloor around New Zealand. And the mapping of it, the actual complete cartographic picture of this entire hidden landmass, didn't finish in 2017 when Mortimer's team made their continental argument. It finished 6 years later, in 2023. When Mortimer and his colleagues published a follow-up paper in the journal Tectonics, charting the northern two-thirds of Zealandia in the same rigorous detail the 2017 paper had applied to the rest. That's not ancient history. As of right now, that completed map, the first time in human history anyone has had a full picture of this continent's true boundaries, is only 3 years old. Sit with that for a second. We have known the shape of every visible continent on this planet for centuries. We finished mapping this one in 2023. And that map isn't just an academic curiosity sitting in a journal somewhere. It has actual physical stakes. Because under international law, the amount of seafloor a nation can claim rights to, the ability to draw boundaries around underwater resources, minerals, fishing grounds, extended territory beyond a coastline, is tied to the shape and extent of the continental shelf beneath its waters. There's a framework governing this, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it hinges on exactly the kind of data Mortimer's team spent years assembling. A completed map of Zealandia isn't just a scientific milestone. It's closer to a property survey finally getting finished decades after the fact and quietly redrawing where a fence line actually runs, except the fence line, in this case, determines who has the right to what lies beneath an area of ocean floor larger than most countries on Earth. I want to be precise about one more thing before we go further, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to blur into something it isn't. You'll sometimes hear Zealandia called the eighth continent, and I understand the impulse. It's a clean, punchy way to say, this counts now. But there's no single global body that hands down official rulings on how many continents exist. There's no committee that convenes and votes yes or no on a landmass's status. Continent has always been as much a convention, a shared agreement among scientists and mapmakers, as it is a hard scientific category with a certificate attached. What Mortimer and his colleagues did in 2017 wasn't petition some authority for Zealandia's admission into an official club. They laid out the geological criteria, applied them rigorously, and made the case in the plain language of measurement and evidence that this landmass meets every test we already use for every other continent on Earth. The label, eighth continent, is convenient shorthand for that argument. It isn't a ruling, it's a description that happens to have stuck. And if this is the kind of rabbit hole you find yourself wanting to keep falling down, hit subscribe, because there's a version of this story that goes even further than the crust itself. One that asks what it actually means that the ground under every one of us, dry or drowned, is running on borrowed time in exactly the same sense Zealandia's was. Because here's what nobody puts in the headline version of this story. Zealandia isn't some exotic outlier, some geological freak accident that happened to one unlucky patch of crust in the South Pacific, while the rest of the planet's continents got to keep their permanent guaranteed spot above the waves. Zealandia is what happens to ordinary continental crust when it runs the same physics every other continent runs, just further. The same iceberg buoyancy holding up the ground beneath you right now is the exact same iceberg buoyancy that used to hold Zealandia comfortably above the Pacific before 80 million years of stretching thinned it past the point where that buoyancy could keep doing its job. Nothing about your crust is a different kind of thing than Zealandia's crust. It's the same material, running the same rules, currently sitting on the fortunate side of a margin that has no promise attached to it. Let me take you back inside that ship for a moment, because I skipped past something worth actually seeing. The Joides Resolution isn't a small operation. It's a drilling vessel built specifically for reaching down through open ocean and boring into the rock beneath it, hauling up cylindrical cores of sediment that read almost like tree rings, except instead of years, each layer down represents a slice of deep time. 6 separate sites, numbered U15X through U1511, scattered across stretches of the Tasman Sea that any sailor crossing them would have called, without a second thought, open water. Nothing to suggest what lay beneath. Think about what it actually takes to pull a fossil pollen grain up from a kilometer of seawater and then more rock below that. The drill string has to punch through open ocean first, a kilometer of water pressing down, cold and lightless for most of that depth, before it even reaches the sea floor. Then, it has to bite into rock that's been sitting undisturbed for tens of millions of years, rock that was laid down, compressed and sealed away long before anything resembling a human eye existed to look at it. And somewhere inside that column of extracted core, a fern spore, a pollen grain, something that could only have formed on a living plant, rooted in soil, breathing open air under a sky. That's the detail I keep returning to. A pollen grain doesn't drift down and settle onto the open ocean floor. It comes from a plant standing on land, shedding it into wind that carries it a short distance before it falls. For that pollen to end up sealed inside rock, now sitting a kilometer under the Tasman Sea, the place it fell had to have been dry ground once, not nearby dry ground. That exact patch, right there, had to have been standing in the sun, growing something. Somewhere between 50 and 80 million years ago, according to the dating on that rock, someone, some ancient organism I'll never know the name of, was growing on ground that is now permanently, silently underwater and has been for so long that not one human being ever stood on it, farmed it, named it, or fought over it. It simply existed, did what land does, and then it didn't anymore. And nobody was there to notice the transition because there was no one there to notice anything. I want to sit with the mechanism itself a little longer too, because I don't think the crust got thinner quite lands with the weight it deserves the first time you hear it. Picture the ground beneath your house or your street or wherever you happen to be right now as not a fixed slab bolted onto the planet, but as a raft. A thick, heavy raft of lighter rock floating on a sea of much denser, slower-moving material underneath it. Rock so hot and under so much pressure that over long enough timescales, it behaves less like solid stone and more like an extremely thick, extremely slow-moving fluid. Your raft isn't going anywhere fast, but it is floating. It has a waterline. And the depth of your raft below that waterline versus how much of it rides above is entirely a function of how thick the raft is. Stretch that raft, pull on it from two directions, the way plate tectonic forces pulled on Zealandia as it separated from the rest of Gondwana, and it doesn't rip cleanly in half like a piece of paper. It necks down the way taffy does when you pull it, thinning gradually across a broad stretch of its middle while staying thicker at the ends where the pulling force originates. Every centimeter that raft loses in thickness, it loses a corresponding amount of freeboard, the height it can maintain above the waterline. Thin it enough over a long enough stretch of geological time, and the waterline that used to sit safely below your feet creeps up past your ankles, past your knees, and eventually closes over your head without a single dramatic moment you could point a camera at. That's the part that unsettles me most, if I'm honest. We instinctively want a discovery like this to have a scene, a wall of water crashing in, a single terrible day. But subsidence like this doesn't work in days. It works in increments too small for any living thing to perceive, stacked up over spans of time that dwarf the entire existence of our species, until the cumulative total finally crosses a threshold that was invisible at every single step along the way. Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. How would you know if this were happening to the ground under you right now? Not in some dramatic single-generation way. Nobody's suggesting your house is about to slide underwater next year. But in the slow, multi-million-year sense, the Zealandia sense, you wouldn't know. Nobody would. The forces reshaping the elevation of a piece of crust operate on timescales so far outside human experience that even geologists who spend their careers thinking in those timescales still have to consciously translate the numbers into something their own intuition can grip. 80 million years isn't a long time the way a long line at the store is a long time. It's a length of time in which entire categories of animal have risen, dominated the planet, and gone extinct. It's longer than the time separating you from the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs several times over, folded into a single process that, from the crust's perspective, was really just one long, unbroken exhale. There's another layer to the isostasy story worth walking through slowly, because it explains something that might otherwise seem strange. Why didn't Zealandia's crust just keep thinning indefinitely, all the way down to nothing, the way you might expect if you kept pulling that taffy forever? The answer is that continental crust and oceanic crust aren't different thicknesses of the same substance. They're genuinely different kinds of rock. Continental crust, the silicic, granite-rich material that makes up dry land everywhere on Earth, is less dense than the basaltic rock that floors the open ocean. That density difference is baked into the material itself, not just its thickness. So even when continental crust gets stretched thin down toward that 10 to 30 kilometer range recorded beneath Zealandia, it's still less dense, still more buoyant than the oceanic crust sitting right next to it on the seafloor. It rides lower than it used to. It rides low enough to vanish under the waves, but it never stops being continental. It never crosses over and becomes ocean floor. That's precisely why Mortimer's team could still call it a continent in 2017, despite it being almost entirely submerged. The material identity of the rock survived the thinning, even though the elevation didn't. That distinction, material identity surviving even when visibility doesn't, is where this story stops being about one stretch of the South Pacific and starts being about something closer to a pattern the planet keeps running over and over at every scale you care to look. Because here's the thing that struck me hardest once I'd sat with all of this for a while. Zealandia isn't a one-off event in Earth's biography. It's a demonstration of a rule. The same tectonic stretching that thinned Zealandia's crust past the point of staying dry is the exact same process, running under the exact same physics, currently active in multiple places on this planet at once. I mentioned basin and range and afar and the Aegean earlier as places doing this right now. But I want you to actually picture what doing this right now means, because it's not an abstraction. In afar in East Africa, the crust is being pulled apart at a measurable rate, year over year, the ground genuinely widening the way Zealandia's once did, early in its rifting, 80 million years before anyone would notice the result. Geologists studying afar today talk about it as a live preview of ocean formation, a place where you can watch, in accelerated but still human glacial time, the opening act of the exact process that eventually pulled a continent under the Pacific. That's the fractal quality of it, the thing that made me feel a little unsteady the first time I really understood it. Zoom out from the one story of Zealandia, and you find the same pattern recurring at every scale geology operates on. A single fault line stretching a few meters of crust, a rift valley stretching a few hundred kilometers, an entire drifting continental fragment stretching across an ocean basin over tens of millions of years. Different sizes, different timescales, same underlying trade-off playing out identically each time. Stretch continental material thin enough, and the buoyancy that used to hold it above the waterline eventually can't do the job anymore. It's the same physics, whether you're looking at a crack in a highway or the floor of the Tasman Sea. The scale changes, the rule doesn't. And once you see that pattern clearly, you can't really keep thinking about continents the way you did before this conversation started. You stop picturing them as fixed, permanent objects, solid, unchanging chunks of the world map, the way they're drawn in every atlas you grew up with, bold black outlines that imply permanence, implying this is simply how the world is and always will be. What Zealandia forces you to see instead is that every continent is really a process caught mid-motion, a momentary state, a patch of crust currently thick enough, currently buoyant enough to be riding above a waterline that has never made any promises about staying where it is. North America is not thick because it's fated to be thick. It's thick right now, at this moment in a multi-billion-year planetary history, because it hasn't yet been subjected to the kind of prolonged stretching Zealandia was subjected to starting 80 million years ago. Nothing about its position above the waves is more permanent, more structurally guaranteed than Zealandia's was, right up until the point it wasn't. I don't say that to be alarmist. Nobody is suggesting the ground under your feet is about to disappear on any timescale that should concern you, your children, or your children's children. The processes we're talking about play out over spans of millions of years, spans so far outside the reach of a human life that worrying about them the way you'd worry about, say, a flood next spring would be its own kind of category error. But there's a difference between this won't happen to you and this can't happen at all. Zealandia is proof that the second statement was never true for any continent, including the one currently under your chair, your bed, your city. It was never a special exception written into the rules for one unlucky patch of Pacific crust. It's what the rules do, given enough time and enough stretching, to any piece of continental rock unlucky enough to sit at the edge of two plates pulling apart from each other. Which brings me to the part of this that I think about far more than I probably should, usually late at night, in the kind of unhelpful way that doesn't actually change anything about how I live the next day, but sits there anyway, quietly rearranging how solid the ground feels under me. Every coastline you have ever stood on, every beach, every cliff edge where the land simply stops and the water begins. That boundary isn't a fact about the world in the way you've always assumed it was. It isn't a fixed line, a border drawn once and settled for good. It's a decision the crust made and is still making about how much buoyancy it currently has left to spend. The coastline is not where the land is. The coastline is where the land's current margin happens to run out. Move that margin, thin that crust by even a modest amount over a long enough stretch of time, and the coastline moves with it, not by the water rising up to meet the land in most cases, but by the land itself quietly settling down to meet the water, exactly the way Zealandia's did. Now, think about what that actually means for you, specifically, not as an abstraction about tectonic plates in general, but as a fact about the exact patch of ground currently holding you up. Whatever continent you're on, whatever city, whatever room, the solid feeling under your feet right now is not a permanent fixture of the universe you happen to have been born into. It's a current balance, a margin being maintained moment to moment by physics that has no long-term commitment to keeping it that way. You've spent your entire life treating dry land as a baseline fact about reality, something so fundamental it doesn't even register as a claim that could be false. Zealandia is the proof that it was always a claim, a conditional one, true until it isn't, the same way it was true for a piece of Gondwana for hundreds of millions of years, right up until the stretching started. There's something almost vertiginous about applying that same logic to your own body, and I want to walk through it carefully, because I think it's the real reason this story stuck with me the way it did. You think of yourself as a fixed thing too, a person, a name, a face in the mirror that's recognizably, continuously you from one day to the next. But you are, in the most literal biological sense, a process caught mid-motion in exactly the way a continent is. The atoms making up your hand right now are not the atoms that made up your hand a decade ago. Almost none of them are. You are a pattern that has persisted, a shape that has held its form, while nearly every physical component making up that shape has been replaced again and again over the years you've been alive. You call that continuity you, the same unthinking way you call the ground under New Zealand land, because it has always presented itself that way, because you've never had a reason to look closer, because the margin has always, so far, held. And here's the part that I think is the real gut punch hiding underneath all the geology. Zealandia wasn't destroyed in 2017. It wasn't created in 2017 either. It was there the entire time. Every single day, some New Zealander walked along a beach. Every day, a fishing boat crossed the Tasman Sea directly above tens of thousands of square kilometers of submerged continental crust. Every day for millions of years before a single human being existed to walk anywhere at all. The continent didn't wait for anyone's permission to be a continent. It didn't require Nick Mortimer's paper or the Joids Resolution's drill cores or a peer review process to have already met every criterion that makes something continental. Those things didn't create the truth. They caught up to it. Reality had already settled the question tens of millions of years earlier. Human awareness was just extremely embarrassingly late to the meeting. Sit with that, because I think it's the real sting under this entire story. There is a version of being wrong that isn't really about being wrong at all. It's about not yet having looked. For every day of recorded human history, for the entire span of maps and atlases and globes spun by curious hands in classrooms, the honest, correct shape of this part of the planet was sitting right there, fully formed, waiting. Not hidden the way a locked room is hidden the way something can be, in plain view, uncatalogued simply because no one has yet had the tools or the framework or the reason to categorize it correctly. Zealandia wasn't lost. It was just never counted. There's a difference, and it's not a small one, because it means the map you grew up trusting, the one with 7 continents on it, confidently colored, confidently labeled, was never a complete description of the planet. It was a description of the planet as far as anyone had bothered to look, which is a very different thing and always has been. I keep circling back to that image of the hand pressed flat against a map of India, because it's the only way I've found to actually make the scale of this land underwater feel real instead of just numerically true. Try it yourself sometime, even just in your head. Picture the outline of the Indian subcontinent, a shape most of us can at least roughly summon, one of the more recognizable landmasses on Earth, home to well over 1 billion people, a landmass whose name and shape are common knowledge practically everywhere on the planet. Now, picture that entire outline at that scale, pulled a kilometer straight down in one continuous sheet and covered over by open ocean, and left there. Left there so completely, so thoroughly, that not one atlas printed anywhere on Earth for the entire history of cartography thought to include it. That is the scale of the thing this story has been quietly asking you to hold in your head the whole time. Not an island chain, not a scattered archipelago that got a little wet around the edges. A landmass on the order of a subcontinent, present the entire time, absent from every human record of what this planet actually looks like, until a research vessel finally pulled the right piece of rock up from under a kilometer of water, and someone looked at it closely enough to notice what it was actually saying. Think about what it actually took to build a case rigorous enough to convince the scientific community that this landmass deserved the word continent. Because the answer isn't a single eureka moment. It's decades of unglamorous patient measurement, stacked layer on layer, the way sediment itself stacks up on an ocean floor. Satellite gravity data was one piece of it. This is a strange, almost counterintuitive kind of measurement. Satellites orbiting far above the planet, sensitive enough to detect the tiny variations in Earth's gravitational pull caused by differences in the density and thickness of the rock below, whether that rock sits under open air or under 2 kilometers of seawater. Denser material, like the basalt of the ocean floor, pulls very slightly differently than the lighter, thicker silicic rock of continental crust. From orbit, with instruments precise enough to catch that difference, you can start to trace the outline of something you will never see with your own eyes, the way you might infer the shape of a buried object under a blanket just from how the fabric settles over it. Sonar mapping added another layer entirely. Ships crossing back and forth over years of research cruises, pinging sound down through the water column and timing its return, building up, ping by ping, transect by transect, an image of the seafloor's actual contours. Not a photograph. A shape, assembled the slow way, out of thousands of individual soundings, each one telling you how far down the bottom was at that exact point. Nothing more. It's a little like trying to understand the shape of a piece of furniture in a pitch-dark room by tapping it in 1,000 different places and writing down, patiently, how far your hand traveled each time before it hit something solid. And underneath both of those remote methods sat the most direct kind of evidence there is, actual rock, physically hauled up from actual depths by research ships dragging dredges across the seafloor or drilling straight down into it the way the geoides resolution eventually would. Every rock sample recovered this way had to be dated, analyzed, its mineral composition checked against known signatures for continental versus oceanic material. One sample tells you almost nothing. 100 samples, gathered over decades by different research groups on different cruises, slowly start to sketch an outline. It's the geological equivalent of assembling a jigsaw puzzle where you don't have the box lid to look at, where you don't even know for certain how many pieces you're missing, and where every new piece someone finds might just as easily confirm what you suspected as completely upend it. That's the unglamorous truth behind a paper like the one Mortimer and his colleagues published in 2017. It wasn't a single dramatic discovery. It was the moment when enough of those slow, patient, decades-long threads of evidence, the gravity data, the sonar contours, the rock samples, the seismic surveys mapping how sound waves travel through the crust at different depths, finally converged into a picture complete enough and confident enough to state plainly what all of it had been quietly implying the entire time. 11 scientists put their names on that paper. Behind those 11 names sit generations of other researchers whose individual measurements, gathered ship voyage by ship voyage over the better part of a century, made that final argument possible at all. Nobody discovers a continent alone in a single afternoon, the way you might imagine from an old adventure story. You assemble one, piece by piece, out of instruments that were never designed with continents in mind, until one day someone realizes the picture has been sitting there in the data the whole time, waiting for enough of it to finally exist. I want to go back to that tuatara for a moment, because I don't think I did justice to just how strange that animal actually is, and its strangeness is exactly why its fossil carries the evidential weight it does. Lizards and snakes, as a group, share a common ancestor with a separate lineage of reptiles called rhynchocephalians. That separate lineage was once diverse, spread across parts of the ancient world, its members filling ecological roles you'd recognize from lizards today. And then, over the long churn of extinction events and shifting climates across tens of millions of years, that entire lineage died away, everywhere on Earth except for one surviving branch, clinging on in what would eventually become New Zealand. The tuatara is what's left, the last living member of an order of reptiles that otherwise vanished completely, elsewhere, a very long time ago. Biologists sometimes call an organism like this a living fossil, not because the animal itself is ancient. Any individual tuatara is born, grows, and dies like any other creature, but because its entire lineage represents a branch of the evolutionary tree that stopped generating new twigs everywhere else on the planet, while this one, isolated population, kept going. That's why a Miocene-aged fossil from that same lineage matters so much to the drowning debate. It's not just any animal, it's evidence tied to a population that, by its very existence today, tells you New Zealand's landmass has been serving as a refuge, an isolated evolutionary island, for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, long enough for an entire ancient reptile order to survive nowhere else on Earth except there. If the fossil record shows that lineage present in the Miocene, not so long, geologically speaking, after Zealandia's lowest point, then whatever scrap of land was standing above the waves at that low point wasn't just any land. It was land continuous enough, stable enough, to keep an irreplaceable evolutionary lineage alive through what may have been its closest brush with total erasure. And there's a very real, present-tense weight to how this story ends up mattering beyond the science itself, because New Zealand's government has direct, tangible interests riding on exactly how far Zealandia's undersea boundaries actually extend. Extended continental shelf claims under international maritime law aren't symbolic. They determine which nation holds rights to explore and potentially extract resources from areas of seafloor that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers beyond a country's ordinary coastal waters. A more complete, more precisely mapped Zealandia, the kind of map that only became possible with the 2023 follow-up work, gives a country like New Zealand a far stronger, better evidence basis for exactly those kinds of claims. This isn't abstract ivory tower geology. Somewhere in a government office, someone has almost certainly pulled up Mortimer's maps, not out of scientific curiosity, but because a nation's legal claim to a stretch of ocean floor the size of a small country can hinge on precisely how convincingly a research paper draws its lines. There's one more piece of that persistence evidence worth walking through properly, because I only mentioned it in passing, and it deserves more than that. The St. Bathans fauna is the name given to an extraordinary fossil deposit uncovered in New Zealand, a layered snapshot of an entire ancient ecosystem preserved together, not just one species, but a whole community of animals that had to have been living, breathing, hunting, and dying somewhere on emergent Zealandian land in the millions of years following that Oligocene low point. Birds, crocodilians, an entire lineage of crocodile relatives that once called this landmass home, long since vanished from the region entirely. Other reptiles alongside them, sharing the same patch of ancient ground. Think about what a deposit like that actually requires to exist at all. You don't get a fossil record of an interconnected ecosystem, predators alongside prey, multiple species sharing overlapping habitat, from a single wave-battered rock jutting out of the sea with nothing living on it. You get that kind of fossil assemblage from land substantial enough, stable enough to support food chains, soil, fresh water, enough acreage for territories, for breeding populations, for the ordinary business of an ecosystem sustaining itself across generations. Whatever was standing above the waterline in the aftermath of Zealandia's lowest point wasn't a bare rock. According to this evidence, it was functioning habitat, with crocodilians patrolling it the way their descendants patrol wetlands elsewhere in the world today. And the kauri deserves its own moment too, because it's easy to let a tree slide past as background scenery in a story this dominated by drilling ships and drowned crust. But the kauri is one of the most striking living things New Zealand has to offer, and its lineage carries exactly the same evidential weight as the tuataras. These are towering, immensely long-lived conifers, trees whose individual lifespans can stretch across many human generations, belonging to a lineage that researchers have used to argue for the same kind of biological continuity through Zealandia's lowest point that the tuatara and Leiopelma frog lineages suggest. A tree doesn't drift across an ocean the way a bird can fly or a reptile might conceivably raft on debris. A forest lineage persisting on a landmass, generation after generation, is about as direct a signature of continuously available dry ground as biology can offer. I keep returning to the fact that none of this, not the tuatara, not the kauri, not the St. Bethans fauna, not the 80 million years of stretching, not the 94% submerged beneath the waves right now, today, while you listen to this, needed a single human being to be true. That's the strange privilege and the strange humility of being the species that eventually built ships capable of drilling a kilometer down through open ocean and pulling up the proof. We didn't make any of this happen. We just, after an almost unbelievably long delay, showed up late enough with the right tools to finally read what had already been written into the rock the entire time. 80 million years of stretching. Millions more years settling toward that Oligocene low point, somewhere between 25 and 22 million years ago. Then, tens of millions more years of near-total silence, submerged, unrecorded, while the rest of the planet's biological and geological history kept unfolding elsewhere. Mountain ranges rising and eroding somewhere else entirely. Entire families of animals evolving and going extinct on the continents that stayed dry. Zealandia sat through all of it, present but invisible, a witness to nothing because there was nothing above its surface capable of witnessing. Then, within the last handful of decades, in the smallest possible sliver at the very end of that timeline, human instruments finally got precise enough to notice. If you compress those 80 million years down into a single calendar year, human awareness of Zealandia as a continent wouldn't even register in the final second. It would be a fraction of an instant, right at the very end, after everything else had already happened. That's the scale mismatch sitting at the heart of this entire story. Not just the size of the landmass, not just the depth of the water covering it, but the almost absurd disproportion between how long this continent existed in its current, fully continental form, and how long humans have known that fact about it. We are not discovering ancient history when we talk about Zealandia. We're catching up, embarrassingly late, on something that was never actually hidden in any meaningful sense, just unmeasured, uncategorized, sitting in plain sight underwater that ships have been crossing for centuries without anyone thinking to ask what, precisely, was underneath their hull. There's a kind of humility in that timeline that I don't think enough people sit with. Every framework you've ever been taught to organize the world with, 7 continents, fixed borders, a settled, finished map of the planet, was built by people working with the tools and the data available to them at the time. And every one of those frameworks has always been provisional, whether anyone said so out loud or not. Zealandia isn't an exception to how solid our knowledge of the physical world is. It's a reminder of the ordinary, unglamorous truth behind all of it. The map was never finished. It was just the best version anyone had gotten around to drawing yet. Take a breath. Feel it fill your chest and hold it there for just a second before you let it go. Somewhere south of you, or north, or on the other side of the planet from wherever you're sitting right now, that same breath's worth of air is moving over a stretch of ocean that looks like nothing. Empty blue, no different from any other empty blue on any map you've ever glanced at, and underneath it, right now, while you exhale, a continent the size of a subcontinent is sitting exactly where it's been sitting for tens of millions of years, unbothered, unwitnessed, waiting for absolutely nothing, because it never needed anyone to notice it to be real. I don't know how to end a story like this except honestly, which means telling you it isn't finished. Nobody knows for certain whether Zealandia went fully under at its lowest point or held on by the thinnest possible thread of surviving ground. That question is still open, still being argued by people who've spent their whole careers staring at rock the rest of us will never touch. And I find I don't mind that it's unresolved. Some of the best stories the planet has to tell us aren't finished yet, and won't be. Maybe not in my lifetime or yours. What I keep coming back to is that hand, flat against the shape of a subcontinent, pressing down until it disappears beneath an imagined kilometer of water. Somewhere under your own feet right now, whatever margin is holding you up is doing exactly the same job Zealandia's crust used to do, running on the same physics, with no more permanence promised to it than was ever promised there. You're not standing on solid ground, so much as you're standing on a very long, very patient exhale that hasn't finished yet. Take a breath. Feel it. And remember, next time you look at a map, that it was never really finished. It was just the best anyone had gotten around to drawing so far.